Now entering the Bitcoin Podcast Network.
Today's episode is brought to you by KeepKey, the easy, safe, and simple way to protect your Bitcoin, Ether, Litecoin, and many other digital assets. There's no time like the present to protect yourself from hackers, malware, and viruses. Visit keepkey.com to order your secure hardware wallet today and use the code HUMANIST10 for a limited time 10% discount. And this episode is also sponsored by my patrons on Patreon. We got about 40 at about $700 a month, and so I like to give different examples each episode for why they support. And here's from my listener, Sebastian. He says, "You're really leading the march on the diversity front, and I want to congratulate you and thank you for helping to open my eyes to the issue." Thank you, Sebastian. So today we chat with Taylor Pearson, an author and editor-at-large for Ribbon Farm, who's into crypto, and we chat about a bunch of different things: social scalability, blockchain as time, the blockchain individual, complex systems, this refactor event that he just organized, and comparing that to consensus. And it's a good episode. It covers a lot of ground, and a couple things kind of pop to the top. The first is that Taylor really knows his books and content. We talk about Seeing Like a State, Black Swan. We talk a lot about Nick Szabo, and you can kind of imagine this episode as like curating a lot of Nick's writing. And from all those things, we talk about a bunch of kind of crazy things with kind of funny big words like techno-economic societal paradigms, or neo-feudal blockchain lords, or authoritarian high modernism, or crypto-econophysics. So those are some fun words that we use in the episode today. So there are kind of three big things that came out of the episode for me that I want to quickly chat about here. The first is when Taylor and I chat about the transaction sector, and he gives this great statistic that says, hey, the transaction sector, which is accountants, lawyers, and regulators, in 1870 was 24% of gross national product, but by 1970 it was 46% of GNP. And that happened because of specialization. Then you have these middlemen to help between, and we expect for some of those middlemen to go away in the future as a result of disintermediation and what have you. And the crazy thing is that I think that this is, in a deep way, what is happening with crypto that can be kind of hard to understand, which is when you think, oh man, the transaction sectors, things are going to become more fluid or less friction or more liquid or whatever. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's cool, but it's kind of hard to visualize and imagine. So I like to think of it as, these roads, and everything needs to go on them. And right now they're super wide or long or slow, but we are going to be able to decrease the amount of friction that's on them, make them more liquid, and then that actually will have a big impact on society. So it's kind of this weird, kind of abstract way of thinking about it, and this decreased friction thinking that's kind of key to the crypto space. So that's one thing that we talk about, and I love the statistics that he gives. The second thing that we talk about is this organization man turning into the blockchain individual, and that's this idea that in the 50s, people were organization people. They used to work for IBM for 50 years or whatever, and then now, though, we're into this freelancer economy, the blockchain individual thing. And I asked him, I said, hey, I'm crowdfunded through Patreon and StakeTree. I'm a digital nomad. Do I count as a blockchain individual? And he said, hey, you might be, but you might also be this neo-feudal crypto lord. And this has made me do some retrospection myself, which I've been doing recently about, man, like these days, I'm doing work that I'm super aligned with. I've worked hard to make that a reality. But am I this like neo-feudal crypto lord where I'm doing this fun work and then have these like gig economy serfs that are just like doing work beneath me? And in some ways it's true, because like I have essentially a basic income crowdfunded through Patreon, and I have this big social safety net, this big web of trust. And it's, in many ways, it's like so removed from the reality of like quote unquote normal people who are dealing with the day-to-day things and with debt and all these things. So it's like, I'm not sure, it's something that I'm thinking about, which is, hey, if I'm this blockchain individual that's, has a crowdfunded and has essentially some variant on a basic income, and is a digital nomad, Am I a neo-feudal blockchain lord? I hope not, and I'm trying not to be. So if I am being one in various ways, please let me know how I can change. And then the other piece that's interesting from this organization man turning into the blockchain individual is that this is all part of this social structure kind of devolution that we're experiencing now, where you used to have a lot of your connections through work, and now 30 or 40% of people work through the freelance economy. And if those connections, those old work connections, don't exist, then what takes their place? And this is essentially a classic example of a creative destruction externality, when you create a new system and then it kind of removes the old system and has some negative side effects. And this concept is a crucial one to think about what's happening in the future, both from the perspective of something like the organization man turning into the blockchain individual, but also from something that Jordan Peterson talks about is, one of the things I think that he is pretty correct on is this, thinking about religion, thinking about religion in the West, and once you have a lot of decreasing, the amount of people who are into religion is decreasing a bunch, and when that goes away, what happens if people don't have that connection? And I think that that leaves a lot of people confused as to what to do. And you can also think of a lot of the crypto world as people who have lost that kind of deep, meaningful connection to some kind of self-actualization or higher meaning, but are now getting it through crypto as a religion and finding meaning in life through that. Yeah, so that is, those are some of the things we talk about. It's a fun episode. It's bouncing around. It's books, it's systems, it's crypto. So I hope you enjoy it. Hello, everyone. My name is Reese Lindmark, and you're listening to another episode of Creating a Humanist Blockchain Future. In this podcast, we take a systems thinking approach to doing good in the world. And today, we're going to be focusing on Series A macro systems, where we ask the question, where are we as humanity headed? And today, I'm very happy to introduce Taylor Pearson to the show. Taylor is an independent consultant, the author of The End of Jobs, and an editor-at-large for Ribbon Farm. Taylor, thanks for being on the show, and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's exciting. And we are in his apartment in Manhattan. He just came back from Ribbon Farm's crypto conference. I just came back from Consensus. So we are in different states of being, perhaps. But Taylor, I guess you're thinking a lot about and possibly writing a book about some of this blockchain crypto stuff. Could you, at a high level, what got you interested in it?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 or 3 different entry points for me. One is, most of you mentioned, I have a book called The End of Jobs, which is sort of talking about this phenomenon of the gig economy and freelancing and all this stuff. And so this is something that I sort of got fascinated in. I went to college in a small school in Birmingham, Alabama, and it wasn't like a freelancey entrepreneurial vibe. And I sort of, through a series of circumstances, fell into this startup and started freelancing, and it was this kind of whole new world to me. Yeah. And so my book is basically sort of my explanation of why that happened, right? What is it that's going on in the economy and with technology that is creating this sort of freelance gig economy. And so I think I sort of, at some point, there was just sort of flipped a switch in my head. I saw all this blockchain stuff, and I started to see, play out the implications of the technology and see how big of a role it could play in that. And I think we'll talk about that more, so I'll leave that there. And then I think the other thing that was really interesting to me, one of the big influences on my thinking is a guy named Nassim Taleb. His most famous book is The Black Swan. And one of the things he talks about is sort of risk and volatility and how those work. And so he got a lot of credit or accolades or whatever. His book came out just before the 2008 financial collapse, and he had a paragraph where he basically said this whole mortgage thing is a complete pyramid and it's going to collapse. And sort of his insight, or one of his insights, is that as we have this increasingly globalized economy, and you think about it, all these systems which are increasingly sort of tightly interoperable, yep. You have this possibility of cascading risk, right? This is what we saw in 2008, that the U.S. residential real estate market almost triggered a collapse of the entire financial
everything,
system across the entire globe. I mean, it was like, people thought it was the apocalypse.
Yeah.
And so I think one of my hopes is we can sort of architect this crypto ecosystem, which allows us to maintain these levels of coordination. Like, there's a reason all these systems are globalized and they're all tightly integrated, right? There's a lot of benefits to that. But is there a way we can sort of get that level of coordination without having that same risk, without having that same... I think part of that risk is centralization. I think it's probably more multidimensional than that, but that's a big element.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that coming at it from the freelance perspective and saying, the freelance gig economy, and then when you go into blockchain world, you're like, oh man, a lot of those similar concepts about kind of sharing economy, abstraction of trust, those kind of things, you're like, ooh, trustless ecosystem, that's going to play a big role here. And as you say, I mean, the hope is that if you think about the world becoming more tightly connected and faster and more complex, it's like we need kind of our global operating system, our technological global operating system, to kind of get up to that level of complexity that we're starting to go into. So that's a good overview, and you're thinking about, there's a couple of key concepts that you've written about recently. One is this social scalability piece from Nick Szabo. One is this organization person turning into the blockchain man, or one way or the other way. How do those kind of relate to your kind of initial interest in this space?
Yeah, so social scalability, as you said, it's an article by Nick Szabo, and that was sort of like the things I can look back at that sort of flipped the switch for me. He published it in early 2017.
Did he really only publish it in early 2017?
Very recently.
Because a lot of his stuff is like late 90s sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I just read an essay about smart contracts from 1996.
Exactly.
When no one was thinking about smart contracts. But yeah, he published it very recently, and sort of the idea he's talking about is that, the argument he's making is that what makes humans unique is our ability for what he calls social scalability. So initially, this was enabled by things like language and coordination, right? There were, 70,000 years ago, there were 6 to 10 species of the genus Homo, and Homo sapiens, kind of were the ones to last because of this ability to coordinate, right? That you were able to act in a group. And then that sort of ability to act, and we were talking about sort of the end state of this very globalized, very sort of networked world, developed over time, right? So, the evolution of language, the evolution of culture, the evolution of almost everything we call a quote-unquote technology enhanced social scalability. Yeah. Credit cards, all these kinds of things. And so if you think about blockchains have this potential to be the most socially scalable technology, because what they do is you have sort of abstract trust, right? Yeah. That you can engage in trade with someone else without knowing who that person is or having to trust them in any way. Yeah. And so I think that's a really fascinating notion, that we're able to, I think the way he puts it, sort of like trade off like human efficiency for computer efficiency. Yep. So I was going back, I was rereading his paper and thinking about it. I went back and found another research paper looking at the transaction sector of the U.S. economy. And the stat was something like in 1870, 20% of the U.S. economy was in the transaction sector. And by 1970, it was something like 47% of the economy was in the transaction sector. Yeah. So these were people that were acting as intermediaries. Yeah. And I think sort of at a broad level, what was happening there is, you had this increased specialization that allowed people to be more economically productive, but that productivity could only be realized with a lot of intermediaries linking the pieces together, right? If you were a nuclear physicist, you couldn't freelance, right? You were working as part of, Bell Labs or, some sort of large organization, and you needed these intermediaries to put these things together. So this idea of, could we have the same level of coordination, but replacing those human intermediaries with software and basically blockchains. Yep,
exactly. And I think, and by the way, Taylor has a great, the Nick Szabo social scalability piece is relatively long, and you just wrote a nice kind of condensation of it. And I think that's something that a lot of people kind of don't get, is like when you say, hey, the transaction industry, 26% in 1870, whatever, 48% or whatever, and more recently, when we think about that, it's like, oh, if those transaction costs go down, that's a really big deal. And it's kind of something that's kind of hard to feel, but you just think about the whole system becoming more frictionless, more liquid, and that's going to happen. So the social scalability piece, how do you see that kind of then, you see that as part of this, the future of where things are going, and we're going to be able to create more socially scalable structures and things like that. Why, where do you see that going, I guess?
So I guess to the extent I've thought about it, I think I go back to sort of, we were talking about the 2008 financial collapse.
Yep.
There's a good piece. There's an organization, I think they're in Melbourne, Australia. It's like the blockchain research. RMIT. Yes,
RMIT is great. Yeah, Jason Potts. Yeah.
They had a really good essay that was talking about this idea of building sort of like a crypto bank. Mm-hmm. And this idea that the bank would basically, through smart contracts be self-liquidating. That the second its liabilities drop below its asset, it would instantly liquidate everything. All the funds would get returned to everyone. And you wouldn't have sort of like this 2008 situation because you're able to achieve this very high level of transparency through technology as opposed to, the transaction sector, in this case, sort of like regulators and lawyers and accountants and all that.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's sort of the exciting thing to me, that there's this big pushback against globalization and this whole sort of nationalist narrative. And I think a lot of that is very reasonable, right? You sort of see this deterioration of existing social structures, and people feel very sort of anonymous and alone.
Yeah.
And so I think I guess I'm interested in this idea of is there a way we can sort of interact with each other in a way that allows us to maintain sort of the benefits of a very global, very specialized world, without some of the drawbacks that we're seeing.
Yeah. And I think when I hear that, I kind of pattern match into the sovereign individual, where you're a person, you could feel really alone. It's right here. It's on the desk in front of us. You could feel alone with the massive 7.5 billion people, hyper networked, all the various climate change, existential risks, all those things, and it's also hey, can we somehow connect to that greater human organism without feeling dwarfed by it, and while feeling connected to it? I'm not sure what that'll look like, because we've only recently had that ability to really conceptualize it in this sense. Do you think so? Thinking about this, there's a social scalability piece which allows us to do to kind of decrease the transaction cost for creating what I would call organizational technology, where it's nation states, firms, things like that, and it says, hey, we've decreased the cost of trust, therefore people can come together in these new blobs, random blobs. That's one side of where you're interested by. And then the other side is this kind of the time piece. Can you explain this blockchains as kind of a timekeeping machine?
Yes.
Or how do you explain,
I noticed this metaphor keep coming up of blockchains as clocks or watches. And so Nick Szabo has a essay he did on this as well. I think A Trusted Measure of Sacrifice was the name of it. But if you go back and you're in sort of pre-14th century Europe, the way time is tracked is mostly on sundials, and then the time was rung from sort of the church or the parish, or whatever the sort of religious, the bell tower was. And so you're ringing the thing from this bell tower, and you're using the sundial, and in a sense, so everyone trusted sundials because sundials were censorship resistant, right? You couldn't. There was no way for anyone. If your boss wanted you to work longer hours, he couldn't manipulate the sun to stay up longer or stay up lower.
Sundial censorship resistant.
But there were some problems with sundials. For one, they weren't always super accurate. If it was a super cloudy day, you couldn't tell exactly what time it was. And two, when you had this sort of quote unquote centralized timekeeping device, it was very hard to get more specialized, right? If we wanted to meet for lunch at 1 o'clock tomorrow, we couldn't ask the church to ring the bell at 1.
Hey, meet up,
They're just ringing it for major events. And so around the 14th, 15th century, mechanical clocks sort of combined with sunglasses created a way to measure a sort of censorship-resistant, fungible measure of time. That you could toll the hour, the half hour, the 15 minutes very predictably, and everyone would sort of agree that this was a fair measure of time. And so, if you're my boss and you're hiring me to work, we could agree that, I start working on the 7th toll and I stop working on the 4th toll.
Yep.
And we both know that that's a fair amount of time. And so in a lot of ways, the clock was this necessary instrument, the mechanical clock, to move from sort of an economy based on serfdom and slavery, where I as a laborer didn't have some fungible measure of my time that I could sell, to one based on employment in firms, right? Because now all of a sudden, if I'm an artisan, I make shoes for a shoe factory or whatever, a shoe guild. There's a fungible, censorship-resistant measure of that work, which I can then sell, and all of a sudden it creates a market, right? Like if you're only willing to pay me, 5 gold doubloons for my month of work, 8 hours a day, and then I can go find, and John's willing to pay me 6 gold doubloons, and she's willing to pay 7 gold doubloons. And so obviously that was sort of this necessary precondition for the move from farms to cities. Specialized labor, you need to be able to sell your time. And so it very much, you think about the clock, it very much changed the structure of work, right? Because all of a sudden we were able to have this fungible, censorship-resistant measure of time. We could reorganize the way we worked. And so
at that point, it was pretty blurry. It was only it was morning, it was night, there was a sundial, it was just a couple tolls a day or whatever. Right. We've gotten increasingly compact with our time measuring machines.
Yes, and down to the microsecond or whatever right now. So you could sort of extend that over into blockchains, where right now, if you are a user experience designer, you're selling your time, right? That's generally how we're organizing work. But you think about blockchains as sort of this censorship-resistant database, this fungible database, where if I'm a UX designer now and I go to you and I do some UX research, we could track in a very measurable way the effects of that. And I can be compensated based on whatever the effects of that are. And so I think that's going to sort of reorganize the way we think about work and the way the economy is structured, not unlike the mechanical clock.
Yeah, I think that there's it's kind of when I hear that, I think about, do you know Holochain, by the way?
I met one of the founders this weekend.
Arthur maybe or something, or one of the others. Okay. So, they have this weird system where it's like agent based, and it's when I hear this time piece, I'm thinking about a version of reality where it's like we're essentially at all points in time we will all be checking our given realities with the master blockchain ledger or whatever, and then depending on where you are, and so if we're just working you and I together, maybe we're in a state channel, maybe we're in some kind of weird agent-based thing, we're doing our own quick versions of time, and then we eventually go back up to the ledger and say this happened at this version at this point in time, and then there's lots of other things on the ledger. I guess, is there this piece of time here? Is it I'm not sure if I quite get I get the version of time that's fungible, and now I get that blockchains are time-stamped things, but why, I guess, is it that important that we have these new time-stamped transparent databases?
Yeah, I'm not even thinking about it. I think time is sort of one component, right? The clock sort of allowed us to measure time, but I'm thinking about how blockchains are going to allow us to track other resources, which now seem sort of illegible and fuzzy in the same way time might have seemed to someone that was only used to sundials, right? If you are a developer or whatever sort of work you do, we'll stick with the UX designer example. You could, this looks really crummy and this looks really good and this works okay. And you can sort of tell, somewhat evaluating people, how good this work is or how bad this work is. But it's sort of fuzzy, sort of in the same way I think time would be fuzzy to the sundial. But all of a sudden, if you can, I talked to a guy a couple of days ago, and he was sort of building this idea of a it was like a blockchain code marketplace. So like if you write a piece of open source software, they sort of are trying to create this mechanism where, if every time I API call that, I use that software, I'm compensated in some token for building that library or whatever that thing I contributed is, which we just haven't been able to do in the past because it just wasn't feasible. You couldn't make these sorts of tiny transactions. And so the choice was either you just gave the software away for free, or you had to find some other way. You gave the software away for free, and that built up your reputation, and you sold your time, or you had to package it in a product or some other way.
But now we can do these function as a service kind of things.
Yeah, that's a good term. I heard that.
That's a good term for it. I guess so. So you're talking about something like the NDimensional money stuff, where we went from one-dimensional money, like US dollars, and now we have NDimensional money, where it's just like it could track anything. How is that? I guess loop it back to the timepiece for me. Why is this timepiece that clock metaphor? Is it primarily a clock from the perspective of, hey, at any given clock tick, here's the current state of all the things in the world, and that blockchain keeps that clock tick, or how do you see blockchains changing that clock tick, I guess?
So I guess the example I think of is the term I usually, you're legibilizing. So this idea of previously time was illegible. It was very hard to measure. It was very hard to track. It was sort of fuzzy and nebulous. And then you had the mechanical clock come along, and it became legible, which allowed you to do new things with it that you couldn't have done previously. And so the project I saw that sort of made this click for me was the basic attention token, which I don't know a lot about the project actually, but this idea, right, that attention, which is this, like time, is this scarce resource, which we all agree is valuable, but which we have a very difficult time measuring. Right? I don't know, I can't look at an account of how I'm spending my attention, though I would like to, right? Like I would like to be able to audit that and go, how am I, what am I paying attention to right now? Is this what I want to be able to pay attention to? So the idea is you can start to actually sort of measure those things, and in a way, like create markets around them, right? That I'd rather pay for this than have to give up my attention for it, or vice versa. Yeah, I agree that the basic attention token. Sometimes you'll tell people, you're like, hey, you usually use Facebook, and when you're giving your attention to Facebook, the advertiser's paying for your time, and they're giving it to Facebook. And then you're like, but with basic attention token, you can get paid for your attention. And then that for people, they're like, whoa, they have this kind of feeling of like, oh, I am giving my attention to Facebook, and they are getting paid, and I should get those basic attention tokens.
Cryptocurrency is vibrant and exciting, but it's not without its share of bad actors. Exchanges and personal accounts can get hacked, computers can be infected with malware. Left unprotected, your digital wealth is up for grabs. Don't let yourself be a victim. KeepKey is the safest and simplest way to protect your Bitcoin, Ether, Litecoin, and other tokenized assets. This hardware wallet is a separate device that you control. Brought to you by the pioneering team at Shapeshift, KeepKey works with the wallet software on your computer to manage your private keys and transactions. Your device is PIN protected, which provides protection if it falls into the wrong hands. Its large display lets you carefully view and approve every transaction. And if your KeepKey is ever lost or stolen, you can safely recover your device without compromising its private keys. The bottom line, you'll sleep easier knowing that your digital wealth is safe and secure. Visit keepkey.com to order yours today and use the code HUMANIST10 for a limited time 10% discount.
So there's the time piece, there's the social scalability piece. There's also this kind of third concept that you're into, this blockchain, this organization man turning into this organization man turning into the blockchain individual. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so there's a book from the 50s called The Organization Man. It's by a guy named William White. He's a reporter at Fortune. And it's sort of this like really fascinating, I would call it like gonzo sociology book. So he's a reporter for Fortune. He's talking to all these people that work at these big multinational companies. And it was this sort of like, he's talking about, at least in the US, right? There was this shift sort of from this like very frontiersman, in a sense like very entrepreneurial, independent society.
Gold rush kind of stuff, or is that the vibe?
or certainly sort of like, smaller self-sufficient communities to these very large organizations, for the reason you talked about earlier, right? That you could have within the context of a large organization, sort of I think about my dad actually, who grew up on a small farm in Northwest Tennessee, and his number one goal in life was to get off the farm. Yeah. Because you wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning and you work until 9 at night, and it's not particularly fun. Yeah. And so he went to school and he got an education, and he got a job for a company, and that was a lot better than working at the farm, because he had a specialized skill. And within the context of his company, that skill was, very valuable to the market. And so that's kind of the economic piece, but this had sort of sociological implications, right? Yeah. So there's this chapter on the suburbs, right? And everyone lives in these same sort of cookie cutter houses, which are in these sort of, cookie cutter subdivisions. And then he calls it I'm trying to remember now, it's like the collectivist ethos, right? But all of a sudden people had this sense that what was most important was the organization, that this sense of belongingness, and that without the organization I am nothing. And in a certain sense that was true, right? Without the organization, my dad goes back to the farm, and so the organization plays this really important role. Yeah. But at the same time, you get the sort of anti-organization man of the organization era was the scientists. So there's always this interesting tension in organizations that employ a lot of scientists, because sort of the highly conformant scientist was also a very unproductive scientist, right? That you needed these sort of people embedded within the organization, like a Bell Labs or a Xerox PARC kind of thing, that were doing sort of weird stuff in this very individualistic sort of anti-establishment way. Yeah. And so one of the things I sort of took away from that book is this idea of sort of you have these different techno-economic paradigms, to use a $10 word, but this technology creates this sort of economic structure, which then has social implications, right?
Techno-economic social paradigms.
Just make it really long. But yeah, so we had this, sort of communication technology, the different sort of industrial revolution technologies that allowed for these large centralized organizations to be very, very economically efficient. And so people wanted to participate in them, and that their participation sort of shaped their social reality. And so we were talking about the blockchain earlier as sort of this thing that allows social scalability, that allows people to do highly specialized work without necessarily being within the context of this organization. Right? The example of the developer that writes a library, and then he receives, every time that library is used in some other piece of software, he receives some sort of, micropayment, tokenized thing, compensation for it. Yeah. And so, that's going to have social implications on us too, right? We're going to start to behave differently and act differently because you don't necessarily need to belong anymore, right? That all of a sudden you can be very economically productive outside the context of an organization. And so the internet, that started to be true on the internet, I think. If you look at the industries very touched by the internet, my background is marketing, but if you sold, you did pay-per-click marketing services for Facebook or Google, and you were very good at that, you can make a lot of money without being in the organization, right? You need access to Facebook, and you need, one person to sort of pay to manage their advertising spend. And so I think what blockchains are going to do is, and that's possible, particularly you have very hard metrics, right? I know that I'm going to pay you $1 to do these advertising, and you're going to give me $2 back in revenue. Yeah. And as a business, you'll always pay $1 to get $2, right? You pay as many dollars as you can as long as that continues to be true. And so this idea that that sort of phenomenon is going to start to extend much more broadly than just some of the narrow industries it's affected now. Yeah,
interesting. So kind of like an expansion of freelancer / gig / online digital nomad realities. Do you think so for someone like me, I might be a good example of the blockchain man. I am a digital nomad. I am peer funded entirely through Patreon and StakeTree. And I do, StakeTree is like a Patreon, but with ETH. Nice. Yeah, it's fun. So how is the blockchain man, similar or different than like the like sovereign individual? And am I embodying either, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I guess that I sort of have like a ways in which this could go well and ways in which this could go badly scenario. Mm-hmm. I think blockchain to me feels like a very the term I've used is like a neo-feudal technology. Mm-hmm. The other I've been playing with the idea of like the balkanization of everything, right? So you think of I'm trying to remember the stats, but like over the last 50 years, there have been more and more nation states because larger nation states have started to break up. Yep. So like the Balkans was a very dramatic case of this. But this trend, I mean, this appears to be a fairly secular trend and continuing. So this is happening at the nation state level. Within these sort of like internet affected sectors, it's happening at the company level, right? People are leaving the firm to be able to work on an independent basis. Yep. And so I think, we talked the example of the developer, the code library, the UX designer. I think what we'll start to see as that happens is that you realize that, within the context of an organization, maybe, a great developer is paid, making up these numbers, $300,000 and entry level is paid $100,000. Yep. But the disparity between how productive they are is actually probably even larger than that. Yep. The really, really good developer is probably worth $5 million a year. And, the people at the bottom are probably worth, negative or zero, or, much less, right? Yep. You see this very steep power law relationship between the two. So I think there's, going back to this like neo-feudal idea, right? You could see this sort of like class of quote-unquote sovereign individuals or sort of this neo-feudal 1%, whatever you want to call it, where because they're sort of being directly compensated for the economic value they provide. Yeah. And I know I'm separating sort of like economic value and worth as a human being, or totally. Whatever that is. Yes. You can imagine this class of something akin to neo-feudal lords or blockchain feudal lords or digital feudal lords. Yep.
That's my goal, by the way. That's
to be the digital feudal lord.
Yeah. If anyone wants to work on be a serf on my blockchain farm, you can apply for ETH Commons. Yeah.
Yes, I think like there's. It's pretty easy to see the dystopian ways that can play out. I think like my pessimistic view is that like, you see this very like neo-feudal thing and you see sort of, I think the flip side of social scalability, the downside of that is it allowed increased economic prosperity, increased economic well-being, but there was like a real social cost to that, right? Mm-hmm. That, talk about the dissolution of the firm, but often people today, like most of their friends are from work and like they have those friends because they go into the same office and get to hang out, and sort of this like feeling of isolation, I think, is because you've had these other social structures devolve, right? You used to go to church and you had a bunch of your friends at church and you didn't move around as much, right? You're probably going to
close to your family.
You're going to stay close to your family. You're going to live in the same region or the same city, and that's sort of starting to devolve as well. So you could imagine this world of neo-feudal lords with fully autonomous but isolated individuals. So that doesn't seem that great.
Not to mention the AI, robots that are right. They create that are making the money
fighting to stay just at serf status, being overtaken by the AI. But I think maybe the more hopeful vision for that is you're able to see people. The same sort of like sovereign individual, neo-feudal lord idea, right, is also someone who has a large degree of agency, who has a large degree of autonomy, who has a large degree of, probably like creativity and the way they're able to do their work and live their lives. That seems promising. And then I guess my optimistic hope, right, is that it seems like humans, we really need some of these social structures, something between sort of the individual and the state or the blockchain or whatever is at the top.
Globe,
And, I think what the internet started to do is, right, started to sort people based on interest or values rather than just something sort of arbitrary like geography, right? You know, a lot of people that were early in the internet sort of described like growing up and feeling sort of like isolated and like they didn't fit in, and then they found this internet thing and they found whatever the whatever seemingly weird thing they were into, they found other people that were into that as well. So, you know, maybe what it will allow is that all of a sudden you can sort of, you know, find your tribe, so to speak. I don't love the word tribe, but, you know, you're able to sort of organize based on your interest and your values as opposed to something more arbitrary.
Before we kind of move on to the thing that I thought I have on that, there's the thing that I get worried about with that is that people will purely align on their things that they are already close to others on and you'll get a red feed, blue feed kind of situation where you also need to optimize for minimum difference, but also optimize for maximum difference, kind of, where you say, hey, who's also super different from me? Because you want to be aware of what's happening there too, and you don't want to, that's I
guess it seems like the answer is both. Like I think like my social media experience is like, I feel like I get much, you know, and maybe I'm just deluding myself, right? But I feel like I get sort of a broad swath of opinions, and I'm able to, you know, as opposed to if I was just living in whatever, you know, a small town in Tennessee in the 1960s, you just get a much smaller view of the world. Whereas I feel like I have a much broader view. But at the same time, it's equally easy to sort of isolate yourself into this tribal
to your
thing.
people.
Yeah.
So I guess one final kind of question. So we've talked about there's the social scalability piece. There's the blockchain as a timekeeper with like these new NDimensional money and being able to kind of track all these different things. And there's also the kind of shift away from the organization man to the blockchain individual. So another thing I know that you're interested in is kind of like complex systems thinking. And so how do you, when you put on your like systems hat, what then do you see when you look at the blockchain crypto world?
So I think one of the big things is that I mentioned this idea of like legibility or legibilizing others. And I think that's it's a very two-way sword. The terms originally I got it from this book called Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott. And he sort of talks about it in a very negative light that what happened when like the modern state arose is that you had this like, you know, the example he gives is a forest suddenly becomes just a quantity of wood and you fail to see it for sort of like the holistic thing that it is. You know, it's also a place for the teenagers in the village to go away and get away from their parents and, you know, talk to their girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. And it's also a place, you know, for people to go for walks and socialize. But if you're, you know, a bureaucrat sitting in Paris and you're making decisions about rural France, none of that information, that's not legible to you. You can't see the teenagers walking around because, you know, the seat of government or where these decisions are being made is, you know, geographically moved away, and that data is not legible. What is legible is, you know, how much wood the forest produces.
Yeah, you quantify some KPIs, right. And then
and so you start to make decisions based on that quantity of wood, as opposed to sort of the full thing that it is.
So if blockchain legibilizes many things, then I guess is that a good outcome? Like, there's one kind of fine outcome, which is pre all that stuff, which is like everything's organic and stuff's going. Then there's like the outcome from seeing like a state perspective where it's like, hey, we only optimize for these given KPIs, don't see the full system, and just go and get those KPIs, and there's lots of externalities. And then this future reality is like, oh, we have NDimensional money that tracks all the things on all the blockchains, and like everything is legibilized.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the reality that you think is going to exist?
Well, I think if you could actually get everything legible, it might work, because then all of a sudden you can account for everything. But I think the more likely scenario is we're going to get a lot more stuff legible, but we're necessarily, you know, there's probably never going to be like a love coin that tracks, you know, the people you love.
My friend is making like coin, so
okay, maybe there is. But, you know, it seems like there will always be some illegible things, and often those things are the things that are very valuable to us, like, you know, how much you love your partner or your
sense of connection,
whatever.
Sorry, I interrupted, but was that from a systems hat perspective? That's where you're going. Is that kind of?
Yeah, that I think legibility can be good as long as you sort of know what you don't know, right? That it's helpful to know how much wood the forest can produce, as long as you know that's not the only thing the forest is used for, right? And KPIs are useful, as long as you know that there is more to the reality than the KPIs, right? But I think that's very difficult to do, and may not be, in practice may not happen.
Yeah, I think, and from a systems perspective, it's kind of a weird, systems people can be where they say, hey, there's this very complex system, and like everything, there's all these agents that are interacting with each other in these ways, we have emergent properties and blah, blah. And I think that it's funny because the blockchain feels kind of like, it's like, yes, we understand that everything is complex, and we want to, in some ways, decomplexify it, or like, check everything.
Well, I think a lot of people are approaching, I guess the more optimistic, I think a lot of people are approaching it sort of from that view. The term Scott used in his book is authoritarian high modernist. The sort of bureaucratic imperious is the authoritarian high modernist that is, dictating to this villager in France how they ought to live their lives. And he sort of, he gives a lot of the famines in the Ukraine and the USSR. Right, as an example of, they're looking at the data and they're not seeing sort of like the illegible, in this case, like really tragic human cost for what that is. And I was going somewhere and I've totally lost my train of thought.
But yeah, pretty much that the people, when they have that the authoritarian high modernist view, that there's lots of data that they don't see, they can't empathize with those people down there. And I was saying that the systems, the kind of negative perspective is that the blockchain folks want to take the system and make it all, it's not necessarily bad or good, but they want to take the whole system and make everything clear about that system, and then optimize it, with incentives and various coins or whatever.
I remember where I was going now.
Nice.
Like markets are interesting because the markets sort of allow for, you get coordination without the central authority, right? There's I'm trying to remember the name of this paper now. It's Friedrich Hayek is like from the 20s or 30s, but he talks about this idea of like the price mechanism is a measure of information. When bacon became popular in hipster restaurants, the price of bacon went up, and everyone else involved in the bacon industry had to make decisions based on that without needing some central planner to coordinate who could do what. So the pork farmers knew that, if I make more pigs or whatever, then there's more money to be made in bacon, and other restaurants have to decide, maybe we should serve less bacon, or do we increase our prices on our menu to compensate for this? And so you're able to aggregate and pass all this information around. So I think there's some sense or some vision of like, if blockchain is sort of expanding markets into all these new illegible things, maybe we're able to like more effectively sort of like aggregate that information.
Yep. And there's something kind of hyper-capitalist about it, where it's like marketize all the things, and there's also something where like the people who want to marketize all the things believe that some of the issue now is that we have markets on many things but don't have markets on all things. So I think there's also a book, Radical Markets, that Vitalik just referenced.
I read their view.
Which I think is going to be, we'll have some of that information as well, which is, hey, what happens when we turn lots of things into markets? So my final question for you, Taylor, today is, thinking about, so you just organized this Ribbon Farm Refactor Camp, which was a blockchain crypto, a bunch of Ribbon Farm folks getting together to talk blockchain crypto. And Ribbon Farm, by the way, for people who don't know, is this great like long form journalism website that has kind of off the cuff ideas or whatever. And when Taylor went to that, I went to CoinDesk's Consensus, which for me personally, different people have different alignment with different things. I was not too aligned with the Consensus conference. Lots of people from Deloitte and doing enterprise stuff or whatever. So tell me, just make me jealous for a little bit and tell me what was like one or two of your favorite things from that conference, vibes, talks, any of those things that from you organizing this Ribbon Farm event.
So it was probably the opposite. I mean, it was much. I think we had 130 people in a sort of warehouse co-working space in rural Texas. But yeah, it was really interesting. I guess sort of my hope with the event was just to get a bunch of interesting people together and see what sort of like weird stuff we could get up to. So I guess a couple of things we were talking about. blockchains or like Bitcoins and space travel, that you have to have the information is limited by the speed of light. And so, what happens, the example someone gave is, if you're taking a starship to Alpha Centauri, which I think is like 5 light years away, and you have a bunch of debt on Earth, you could pay off all your debt halfway on that trip, and before that, the information in that block got hashed and sent back to Alpha Centauri. You'd have like 3 years on Alpha Centauri to blow all your money and double spend it because the information wouldn't get passed around. So sort of like the speed of light
beating the double spend problem.
And then I've heard people talk about that. There's like some real Earth implications of that as well, right? Because on Earth we're still limited by the speed of light. It's just the scale is much, much smaller, so it's less of an issue. What's the other talks? There's one on crypto econophysics. It's sort of making this analogy between how flight works, the dynamics of flight and flows, and sort of like how that analogizes to the crypto ecosystem. So this idea of how an airplane gets lift. Is if you could sort of zoom in on the molecules around an airplane wing, there's this sort of like very frothy barrier layer where the molecules are sort of moving very quickly. They're going in these little circles. I don't remember any of these terms. And then sort of this like calmer space around, right? Sort of if you look at sort of like the crypto market or the crypto ecosystem, and then just everyone else on Earth, right? There's this sort of like frothy barrier of individuals that are sort of propagating this out into the broader ecosystem, and so achieving the sort of liftoff. As engagers accelerating. Crypto seems to have some interesting, unique properties that have accelerated that lift in a lot of ways.
I think that for someone thank you for both those examples, I think that for someone who went to consensus, they would also, for many of them, they're like, great, I'm glad I went to consensus and not your thing where you talk about techno-econophysics and the speed of light going to, Alpha Centauri and double spending. So with that, we're pretty much out of time. Taylor, you can buy his book, The End of Jobs, theendofjobs.com. Is that right?
Yeah.
You can also find Taylor on Twitter. What's your Twitter username?
Taylor Pearson, me.
Boom. And anything else you'd like to tell our listeners?
That's it. Thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening. And if you want to support me on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/RieslinMark. That's patreon.com/RHYSLINDMARK. Or you can go to staketree.com/RieslinMark to stake some ETH. Okay, goodbye, everybody.